Good afternoon, everyone joining. We'll just give it a minute and wait for a few more people to join before we get started. Good afternoon, everyone. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Before we get started, I'm just going to run through a few things on our end. So please note this webinar will be recorded and all attendees will be muted throughout the webinar. And to ask any questions, please use the Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen. And when the webinar ends, you'll be directed to complete a short survey for us. This will take less than a minute to complete and your feedback will be anonymous. And if you've dialed in as a guest today, you can view more information about becoming a member and having access to more events like this at www.sapusers.org/register. And if you have any questions, please contact us at support@sapusers.org. I'll hand over to Gerald now, who will speak on the rest of this webinar.
Thanks, Toby. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session. Let me just share my screen. Right. So today we're going to be talking about value. This is such an important subject, one that probably doesn't get enough attention as we're just focused on getting things done. We don't actually reflect on the value of what it is we're actually doing. So what I'd like to do is bring a bit more focus to the value and specifically around application access governance. So first, a bit about me. I have been working with SAP for just over about 26 years, mainly around security and controls, but I've had the opportunity to work in a number of different areas, running SAP programs, running the SAP operation, value realization, license management. All of these are focused on protecting and unlocking business value, which has pretty been the theme of my entire career. And in fact, last year I set up a company, Caracan, which is focused on protecting and unlocking business value. And we do this in two ways. One is working with organizations to elevate their controls and drive more value from their control investments, but also working with selected enabling organizations like software companies that drive more value or deliver more value to these customers. So I'm absolutely delighted to be working closely with Pathlock, who are one of the leading companies in this space, to advise on how we elevate customer controls and drive more value from the tool sets. So that's the context in which I will frame a lot of the conversation. The examples I will use will come from Pathlock. And I have a lot of experience with Pathlock because I was a customer for about 13 years. And we had a lot of opportunity to see this value in action and realize a lot of value. But also now as an advisor, I am seeing the roadmap and more exciting value that's in the pipeline. So with that, I will dive into the main presentation. We're going to talk about three things. The first is how we identify the value in our application access governance processes. And then we'll look at how we actually measure the value, quantify it, and finally, how we actually unlock it, how we actually realize this value. So those are the three main areas we will focus on.
Sorry, Gerald, should we be seeing your screen?
Oh, sorry, I thought I was sharing my screen.
Apologies. No, we can't. No worries.
Here we go. I didn't click the share button. That's a crucial element. Here we go.
Perfect.
Can you see that now?
Yeah, perfect.
Let me move. Okay. Brilliant. Thanks. So identify value, measure value, realize value. Those are the three main areas. So let's go into the first, which is identify value. So one of the first things is what is value? It really is about the measurable benefit. And in the context of application access governance, it's the measurable benefit realized by an organization when its access governance processes improve risk posture or operational efficiency. And strategy is probably another thing, but all while supporting the business outcomes. So you can break it down into probably three main areas of value. So there's value that's related to risk. So whether it's reduced risk of fraud, errors, data breaches, you could look at fewer audit findings and penalties, improved compliance posture, whether it's internal or external. Is efficiency based view. So that's time saved through the automation of provisioning, for example, or approvals, reviews, lower administrative overhead, faster onboarding, offboarding, role changes, etc. And then the third category, which is one that is really it's key, is what I call the strategic business value or opportunity. So ability to scale and adapt access controls during mergers and acquisitions, for example, or reorganizations, or indeed digital transformations that are happening quite a lot at the moment. Improved agility without compromising control. I think that's a key thing. Increased confidence from regulators. That's really where we want to be. And so this quote, value is what happens when controls no longer slow the business down, but instead enable it to move faster, safer, and smarter. It's like that old adage about, controls are like the brakes on a car. Yeah, if you didn't have good brakes, how fast could you really go? and some people answer that question in different ways. But okay, so moving on. Now, let's talk about the application access governance processes. And there are sort of 5 key processes. Analyze and monitor access, so we understand where our access risk is. Design and optimize that access. So it's typically role building and the architecture of your roles and how the access gets allocated. Request and provision access, review and certify access, and manage privileged access. So processes that everyone will be really familiar with. And we frame them as active verbs because I want to preserve that process mindset, because we often look at it in terms of products or tooling, but actually I think the process mindset is important. So if we then, so we go into analyze and monitor access, we've got 5 sub-processes. So we need to collect and consolidate the access data so that we can then do any analysis on it. So we define our rules, and we identify the SOD conflicts. We can generate alerts and reports. We correlate events across systems as needed, and then we can remediate and track conflicts. These are the core 5 sub-processes underneath that one. Optimize access, so define the access requirements, prevent access conflicts. That's one of the objectives we build into our design. Analyze access patterns to make sure that these align, so whatever design aligns with what's required. Maintain and update access models. So these are either roles or it could be attributes related, depends on the model we're using. It's mainly role-based access control, but we could be using other things as well. Deploy and transition access changes. That can often be a risky stage, even after you've done all the work. It all goes south. Request and provision access. So this is, initiate access requests, validate the request compliance. Then you've got to manage all the approvals. You've got to then, once everything's approved, then execute the provisioning actions. And then there's the whole process around managing the life cycle, movers, levers, changes, etc. Access, similarly, plan and define stage. Then we've got to set up the campaign, so assign and educate the reviewers. Then, of course, we have to do the work to perform and track the reviews. And then there's some remediation, some revocation required, execute and verify those have happened, and document any exceptions and govern those exceptions. And then finally, scenarios where elevated access is required, we need to discover and inventory privileged accounts, or indeed control and vault privileged credentials. So whether it's firefighter roles or firefighter users, those are the two sort of flavors that you can play with. Monitor and record privileged sessions. That's a key aspect of this process. Analyze and alert on suspicious activities. And then most important of all, review and audit privileged usage. That's the key control element in this. So we've got these 5 processes broken down to their sub-processes, and this is where we can spot the value opportunities, the value levers. And to capture where we are in these processes, we introduce a maturity model. So it's a very familiar 5-level model that's used in a number of different contexts, but ad hoc, level 1 is ad hoc, level 2, repeatable, level 3, defined, level 4, managed, and level 5, optimized. And as you move up the levels, effectiveness goes up. So whether it's risk reduction, audit, stronger audit posture, all of these effectiveness value drivers, but also efficiency goes up as you automate processes a lot more, faster provisioning, etc. There's also a really important thing to bear in mind, which is also what I call opportunity. So that is whether it's the strategic enablement, the business agility, there are aligning to business mission requirements is a really important thing, because quite often security and controls can be in this necessary overhead bucket, and necessary overheads tend to be minimized. It's sort of a race to the bottom with necessary overheads. We want to really reposition as much as we can with enabling the business, because that's why this exists. So wherever there are opportunities to align with business direction, that's a really important thing to bear in mind. And naturally, as you move up these maturity levels, there is an alignment with business objectives alongside the efficiency and effectiveness gains. Model to the and that's what I'll just do a very quick of what that looks like. This is a very mix. We have a matrix. We've built up the levels for each of the processes. Just to give you an idea. So if you level 1, typically you're manual, you don't have any tooling, and you're it's the base level. So if we provision as an example, you'll have manual requests. There'll be very inconsistent deprovisioning. Level 2, you probably use ticketing. So you may be getting some workflow approval through your ticketing tool, maybe partial SOD checks. Level 3 is where you expect a little bit more automation, and a bit more consistency. Level 4, your approval, integration with your identity and access management. And then level 5 is usually a lot more advanced. So as a general theme, level 5 is really probably beyond most people's current aspirations, but there'll be some organizations that need a very advanced level of maturity, and that's where there'll be. I think there's a general trend, ultimately, towards level 5 with AI. But typically, when an organization implements tooling, sorry,
if you can hear me quickly, do you want to try and turn off your camera to see that the audio is a little bit better? It's just sometimes it's cutting out a little bit.
Cutting out. Okay, yeah, thanks.
Perfect. Thank you.
Cool. Hopefully this is better. One of the drawbacks of being at the seaside is that I don't have access to very, very good bandwidth. Okay, so we have So it's quite easy to assess an organization on the 5 processes in terms of maturity. And when you see the descriptions of each of these maturity levels for each process, you can quickly establish where you are in this. But you can actually do this at a lower level. You could actually do this at the sub-process level. So if we back into an example, so we take request and provision access. You can see the 5 sub-processes. Let's pick the first one, which is initiate access requests. And if we pick some of the features, so let's pick the first feature, request interface and channels. Yeah. So that's one example. You can see some of the other features like business justification collection. So what we have is a very granular set of features that categorize and flesh out all of the processes, sub-processes, map them to features, and then these in turn get mapped to maturity levels as well. So I'll just illustrate that. So if we take this feature set, which is around the request interface, so we're taking the very sort of start of that request and provision access process. We're saying initiate request, and we're looking at one feature, which request supports initiate process. So the thing is, at level 1, ad hoc, well, it's going to be email, verbal requests, access requested through unstructured ad hoc channels, for example, email or verbal communication. If we then progress to level 2, repeatable, here we have a form. Someone has built a nice form in Excel, which is emailed around, and you have some, access type catalogs, a list of roles or something you can choose from, something pretty basic. So that's the next level, level 2. Level 3 is where you'll probably have something a little bit more structured. You have a self-service portal, the access, dedicated web-based portal where users can submit and track their own access requests. You have structured request forms with mandatory fields, validation, structured data capture. You can search the access catalogs comprehensively. And you will have some level of role-based request templating, so pre-configured request templates aligned to specific job functions or roles. So that's what level 3 would look like on this feature set. If we then move up to level 4 of maturity, you then now looking at some sort of context-aware interface. So the interface will adapt based on the user profile and show the relevant access options. You ideally would have some HR system integration, direct integration with HR systems, which would automate the requests for new hires, for transfers, etc. Similar user suggestions. So in other words, system will access based on patterns from similar users or roles. And finally, you would also be looking at the ability to submit and approve requests from mobile devices. That would be expected. And then at level 5, where you're optimized, that's where you would typically start to get more of the AI driven recommendations. You would be able to proactively suggest, inappropriate, so the appropriate access. You would have system generating access requests automatically based on job changes. Zero-touch provisioning really means standard access, automatically requested and provisioned without human intervention. And then the ability to process requests stated in natural language. That's where I think we are heading with all that's going on at the moment. But that is seen as, that's where we would classify level 5. Another example. So if we move along the request and provision access process to validate request compliance, which is the next step, and pick out another feature set. So the feature set here is SOD conflict detection. So if we take that one, and we step through. Level 1, we would expect the conflicts are detected after. So the SOD conflict discovered only after access has been granted. That's a typical feature of level 1. And the conflicts must be manually resolved after detection. So that's a very manual process at level 1. If we move on to level 2, the basic SOD rule checking, so checking against a basic set of SOD rules, manual comparison against SOD conflict matrix. That's another thing we would see. Again, relatively manual. Slight difference here, the conflicts are detected after submission of the request, but before provisioning. So it's still done proactively. And then another element would be simple notifications when conflicts are detected. So it can happen by simple emails. And then let's move on to level 3. With level 3, we would expect to have automated comparison against comprehensive rule database. So this is typically what happens when you have an automated compliant provisioning tool, like Pathlock's compliant provisioning, that would perform this sort of automated comparison against a rule set. Conflicts are detected during the request creation, as you'd expect, and formal documentation of detected conflicts. That's the structured conflict documentation. And finally, integration with centralized SOD rule engine. That's something would happen at level 3 as well. So then moving on to level 4, we'll have real-time SOD simulation. You may get the cross-system conflict detection, and then you start to approach as well. And finally, level 5, you have more predictive SOD analysis, context-aware conflict evaluation. It's really bringing a bit more AI tech to the whole process. So this gives you a flavor for the ability to assess the maturity level, even at a low level of granularity within the process. So you can do it at a high level, just a general, or you could actually go down to specific sub-processes and look at the features that are actually supporting those sub-processes and where they bring. So a lot of this is mapped out in some detail. So the general game plan is maturity level in the process drives specific metrics. And these metrics relate to efficiency, so automation, for example, effectiveness, risk reduction, audit compliance, and opportunity, which is around the business agility element. And these translate into costs. Ultimately, that's the common currency of value. You can always come up with a financial number effectively. So there are costs, and then those obviously translate to savings, and hence we can calculate a return on investment. So that's the general game plan. So this brings us to how do we measure this value? Well, there are 3 areas that we talk about. So we've talked about risk reduction and security, which is the traditional area we speak about, operational efficiency and cost savings, and we talk about compliance and audit readiness. So risk reduction and security, preventing loss events is one thing, lowering our risk. In terms of operational efficiency, you save time, and you can reallocate labor, and you can also avoid headcount or other costs. And then on the compliance side, there's continuous compliance, which is increasingly a requirement. Improved audit outcomes, which again, really important, and that's the trend line. And greatly, that reduced compliance overhead is also vitally important to reframe what we do to be more business friendly as well. Some example metrics around application access governance. So if we take these 3 categories, risk reduction and security, number of access violations detected, that's a good indicator because it tells you, well, this is the volume of potential problems that might be in terms of these conflicts. Time at risk be exploited. The access risk score is something that it's really useful mechanism for managing certain events. Incident counts is another thing. How many incidents come, and all of these can be costed, and scaled up based on the volume of users or requests or whatever makes sense. Compliance and audit readiness, again, audit readiness time, audit count, a whole range of metrics you can define. And this is just examples. Cost savings, you can look at the process cycle times, the manual effort hours, the cost metrics, etc. The important thing is we've done quite a bit of work in mapping and benchmarking some of these metrics against maturity levels. And this work is continuing. It's an ongoing mapping, and as we with different organizations, we are getting a stronger view of where some of these lead. Now, there are some key metrics that we have seen seem to have a significant impact on the value and the maturity element. So if we pick a few examples, so if we take the analyze and monitor access process, the mean time to resolve SOT conflicts is actually this is the risk exposure, and it's a lower cost of doing so. So if you are doing it manually, it could take, let's say, 4 to 8 hours to do it end to end. But by the time you get to the highest level of maturity, it'll be less than half an hour, possibly a few minutes if you're really at an extraordinary level. And similarly, if you take review and certify access, is a great metric to use because then you can scale that by the number of reviews, number of users, etc. And again, driving this metric down, whether it's 2 to 5 minutes at level 1 down to a fraction of a minute at the highest level. Mean time to provision, that's an obvious metric to use. Faster provisioning, helps with business agility as well. So at level 1, it's typically days. At level 5, it could be near instant. So the approach we take is to assess maturity. That's really important. And you can do it at the actual process level, so relatively high level, or you can go down to the sub-processes and features if you want to get really granular. And you can what action initiatives you want to, and granularity of your initiative. So, for example, the had managing controls around SAP, which is typical. So they had achieved a maturity on SAP of level 3. So fine running, and in some cases, level 4, they were managed, they were fairly advanced in the SAP governance. So that was SAP was looking good. Auditors were happy. Things were flowing. But the non-SAP estate was relatively neglected, hadn't received the same amount of attention. And that happened. That's something that happens often. SAP often goes first because it's where the crown jewels are often hosted. So we do need to bring the non-SAP systems up to a similar level of maturity, and manage some of the cost, the high manual overhead in dealing with some of the risk in these non-SAP systems. So the initiative in this example, they applied Pathlock Cloud, application access governance to bring all of that together across SAP and non-SAP. They thought actually we have some cross-system risks as well. So they do a combined initiative. So this would then, the target was to get those non-SAP AAG processes up to level 3 or 4. So the approach they would take to quantify this value, they could estimate the operational cost reduction. So fewer conflicts, less manual provisioning, etc., and then factor in the level of that would also occur. So there's an efficiency benefit from the automation, but there's also an effectiveness benefit from the risk reduction and the improved audit posture and less incidents as well. And then, of course, you subtract the cost of the tools and the implementation cost as well. That's what approach in a simple mode. And then you realize there's value. So you can quantify the value, and then you realize that there's value by driving the actual initiatives forward and keeping an eye on the benefits as well. That's something that we have to make sure we do using the same frame as we used to frame the business case in the first place. We actually have an ROI calculator. I'm not going to dive into the financial modeling, but I'll just give a high level view. So imagine you look at your current state and your future state, and you look across the 5 processes. Now, what you do is you first capture the risks that you are currently incurring. And the risks are normally in 3, sorry, not the risk, the costs. The costs are normally in 3 buckets. There's the tooling cost, effectively the license cost, and the overheads around it. The people cost, the effort that's required to perform the processes. And then the cost associated with either the risks, the audits, the issues that occur. Yeah. And those are the 3 buckets that the modeling will capture. You also then look at the tooling overhead maintenance. So that's beyond cost. And then look at the transformation. So how the cost of implementing the changes, and then in the new scenario, what's the tooling overhead cost? What's the costing across all of the processes, based on the new model. And then once you've done that, then you look at the savings, which is just the delta. But then, crucially, you need to add savings based on a couple of things. One is the probability of success. We call it the realization factor. And there's always a realization factor. Sometimes it's amazing and you get exactly everything you said you were going to achieve. But in practice, you need to build in a realization factor. It could be 80%, 90%, or it could be 50%, depending on but it gives a bit of realism to what you're doing. The other thing to bear in mind is the bankable factor. So that is how much of the savings that your model is throwing up are actually bankable. In other words, they hit the P&L, the real money, as it were. And again, that will vary depending on the scenario. But it's important to do that because then that builds a bit of credibility when you present these savings or benefits to stakeholders, whether it's financial or budget holders, etc. So you need to generate credible savings, and then from those you actually calculate your ROI based on those, and then you have the right sort of charts, etc. And that's what the model does. So we've talked about identifying value, going into detail in our processes, mapping those processes to features, sub-processes to features, and showing how those features help elevate the maturity levels and align with certain maturity levels, and then metrics that then are effective. And then we've shown how these metrics can then be used to quantify the value, and the savings of initiatives that move organizations up the maturity level in these processes. So in this last section, I want to focus on actually getting the value, realizing value in these AAG processes. I'm just going to talk through, step back for a little bit and frame application access governance. So there's sort of three areas when we talk about protecting value. Application governance is one key area. Continuous controls monitoring is a slightly there's a bit of an overlap, but it's a different area. It has its own scope. And data protection and security is the third area. So I tend to look at these three areas when we frame the processes, and we framed the processes in all of these three. And everyone is doing this to some extent, whether they're using a tool or using standard SAP. Processes are happening in some way, shape, or form. So we can use the same frame to run through the Pathlock portfolio. So Pathlock offers tooling in these three areas: in application governance, continuous controls monitoring, and data protection and security. And these are the actual specific products that fit into those categories. What I'm going to do now is talk about the value equation. So the value equation is a concept. There's a guy called Alex Hormozi, and he came up with this in a much more general frame, but it's very useful within this context as well. So the basic premise is that value is the dream outcome, what you're trying to achieve, what you would ideally achieve, multiplied by the perceived likelihood of achievement. So that's the other element, and that's the numerator. And then the denominator is the time delay, how long before you actually get this outcome, and multiplied by the effort and sacrifice, how much is it going to cost you to actually achieve this. And that's how it's a very useful way of framing value. So if we look at that, we can apply this to application excellence specifically. So if we look through the AAG lens, the clearer and more exciting this outcome is, the more value is perceived. Yeah. So if we look at the dream outcome in application access governance, well, no compliance worries. Now that is a dream outcome. Reduced risk exposure is always expected. Efficient processes, increasingly, that's expected too. Ultimately, peace of mind. If your senior stakeholders, CFO, CI, if they don't have to worry about the next big audit or next big compliance requirement, or then you're in a good place. So the dream outcome can be well defined on that basis. The perceived likelihood of achievement, it's proven track record, industry recognition, robust features and technology, success stories and use cases, support and guarantees. All of these support that perceived likelihood of achievement. So when you're managing your stakeholders internally, those are the sorts of things that will drive that confidence. Now, nothing drives confidence like good history. So for example, if you've delivered value already, if you have had a successful program or project which is measured value that you have then gone and demonstrated, that builds on this perceived likelihood of achievement. Yeah. So that's another element. The third is time delay. Quick time to value is important. Automate slow processes. If you can do real-time monitoring and periodic checks, faster audits and reports, these are all things that affect the time delay. And finally, sacrifice. Automation is key here. We've got to reduce manual work. And when you're doing your value mapping of all your processes and sub-processes, that's the lens through which, we should always be looking. Where's the opportunity for automation here? Workflow and integration to ease the process, make it user-friendly. This can be easily underestimated how important it is to get the user adopted using the right sort of screens and user experience. If you can guide the user, nothing is better than knowledge on demand. So that's another feature. Cost savings, minimal disruption. So if we then maybe turn our attention to some strategic insights. One of the things is to align Pathlock's dream outcome with business objectives. As we said, if you're implementing your controls tool, Pathlock, as an example, if you're looking at that, it's really important that the objectives, the outcome that you frame, as much as possible, needs to align with the business objectives as well. The more you can do that, the more senior stakeholder sponsorship you're likely to get. And you move away from the necessary overhead space to a space, which is a much better place to be and much more advantageous for the organization. So yeah, if you take an example, if one of the top business objectives is to expand into new markets, having strong compliance and security, which is provided by the software, can be positioned as an enabler for that expansion. You won't be slowed down by compliance issues, for example, or onboarding. How the outcomes, compliance, risk reduction, efficiency, will support the business, the success, not just the IT audit department. That's really important. So this sort of alignment will support you. You can use the value equation to prioritize initiatives. Effectively, you are maximizing the numerator and minimizing the denominator. So, for example, to quickly improve with a smaller pilot on a critical system, generate a quick win. So that's one thing. Or to maximize the impact on time delay, you can identify a few processes with long delays, whether manual user provisioning or yearly certification, and automate those first. So you deliver immediate time savings to showcase. So that way you're prioritizing high value outcomes that matters to the business, or if a solution needs to be built. Yeah, so demonstrating early success is key. Or changes that quickly reduce time, effort for quick ROI. So using the value equation is probably a really key takeaway. The more you can use that as a means to prioritize. So other strategic insights you can get from this. One is continuous improvement. Keep raising the dream, keep effort. Yeah. So if you've used some tooling to get to level 3 or level, then maybe you should raise the bar. Well, how do we get to level 4 in our maturity? So that's one thing. And how do we continue to reduce the denominator as well of the value equation? Buy-in is crucial. Can't underestimate. You have to tailor the message to different stakeholders. For a CIO or CISO, would probably emphasize the risk reduction, the dream outcome of security. That's probably where the focus is, and how likely the tooling is to prevent breaches. Perhaps referencing its success elsewhere. So that's the perceived likelihood piece. For the CFO, maybe we highlight and the cost savings, the effort reduction, and the fact that results will be tangible within the quarter, short time delay. So that's another lever we're pulling. For business managers, maybe the ones whose teams are using for example, these certifications workflows, stress how it will make their lives easier, less effort, and not create new burdens, and how it will quickly resolve long-standing pain points like access request delay. So by addressing what each stakeholder cares about, using the appropriate part of the value equation, you can build broad support, which is necessary for adoption. Final thing I'll just quickly mention is risk management strategy integration. So the risk, the capabilities there, if you're implementing Pathlock, the capabilities need to be mapped to the organization requirements in the organization's risk register or compliance calendar. That's a really key thing to align. This alignment point is really important. Just the final bit, a few practical implementation considerations I will just run through. Again, based on the value equation driving it, we want to, we want to clearly define the objectives. So list it, as we said, align these objectives with the dream outcome. So, for example, if we want to implement Pathlock to automate SOX IT controls for SAP and Oracle ERP, or reduce user access review effort by 50% in the next cycle, having these clear goals will help, configure the system appropriately, and the benefits realization element is something that often gets neglected. We need to keep this value consciousness. We need to not just do this value assessment just for the business case to get the funding, but we need to do that after we've actually implemented, and just keep an eye on what the value is. We need that continuous value focus. The next one, phased rollout for quick wins. Phased for quick wins, manage time delay and build confidence. That's what the phasing enables us to do. If we leverage out of the box rules, then again, that's more quick time to value, but we also reduce the effort. We can customize later if we need to, but you can get a lot of value. And particularly, Pathlock invested very heavily in the rule sets to make them very, very valuable right out of the box. And so, yes, you may have specific business, but the likelihood is that you will be getting value immediately out of the box. And so that's something to leverage as well. Integration and data gathering. So again, that affects the effort to set up versus the benefits. So, that's something to keep a very close eye on as well. User training and change management. Well, if the users don't use the tooling effectively, then the value doesn't get realized. So either. And finally, establishing processes for handling alerts and exceptions. Actually realizing risk reduction. It's very easy to generate a whole portfolio of alerts. The tools will be very obliging and can produce really wonderful, informative information. But you still need to do something about these alerts. So you still need to have well-defined, take the prompt from the system and take the right action as efficiently as possible to manage alerts. So this is something this is an enabler for getting more value out of the tool. And finally, monitor and adjust. This is key. This is probably the key difference is in terms of the value consciousness is if you do this on a regular basis and have that built into the culture of the controls, that's probably a game changer in terms of your value posture. And to illustrate this, I will probably just quickly show you an example. If we have so take audit, so imagine a scenario where we're implementing, we're during an implementation, we actually baseline that an upcoming IT general controls audit usually takes, let's say, 4 weeks of preparation. Yeah, ahead of that. So we configure Pathlock to continuously log all privileged access changes and approvals. And then once it's live, we actually then simulate an audit request by pulling a report of all privileged access changes for a particular time period with evidence of approvals, which is typically what you would be required to do. It will only take a few hours to do that with Pathlock versus the 4 weeks previously. You can document this improvement, and then you can then communicate this to your audit and compliance leadership, and perhaps decide to standardize audit prep using Pathlock going forward. So that's an example of how you would use metrics as a feedback loop to drive the right action. Similarly, if you notice, for example, that the emergency access module wasn't used by a certain IT team, maybe they bypassed it in a crunch, then you'd investigate and remind that team of the importance and ease of using the tooling. Maybe they just needed a slight process tweak or an integration with their service desk, etc. These are the kinds of on the ground adjustments that ensure that the tool is fully delivering its value. So, example, and an eye on the clock, I think almost. So, key takeaways. Well, the first takeaway is how important it is to identify value by examining the core application access governance processes and sub-processes, to go granular and tie these to the relevant features, because these can point towards the right level of maturity. Processes and or sub-processes, you can do it at either level or both, and you can measure the key metrics. So this measurement, identification and measurement of key metrics is another key takeaway. So these metrics can show you elements of efficiency, effectiveness, and opportunity. Those are the three dimensions to keep an eye on. Opportunity is the one that frames what we're doing in the controls and security space into something that's a bit more strategic for the business. And that's a great direction of travel if we can get there. But traditionally, effectiveness and efficiency is what we would be expected to do. Assess how these products and product capabilities and features support and enhance the sub-processes and affect key metrics. That's a key element of this. And we have some very detailed use the value equation. If there's one thing that I would say you should take away, alongside the maturity model, it's the value equation. Because it's a very simple framework, but it really helps with prioritizing. You maximize your dream outcome and likelihood of achievement, and you minimize the time delay and effort and sacrifice. And finally, there are some practical considerations which I went through, which are worth studying a little bit more. And if there are any questions, please fire away.
There's no questions in there at the moment. We'll just give everyone a minute, see if there is any questions to come in. I'm not seeing anything as of yet. Must have just explained it very well. No questions to come in, eh? We'll give everyone a minute, see there's just someone saying, yes, you can watch this back. We'll upload it onto our website shortly. I'm not seeing anything else come in. If that is all, then we'll leave it there. Once again, thank you, Gerald, for coming on, and thank you everyone for joining today. And if you have any questions after this, please get in contact with me or Gerald, and we can help you out with that. All right, then. If there's no questions, we'll leave it there. So thank you, Gerald. Thank you all for coming on, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Thank you.